Okay, to start off today's lesson, I would like you to answer the following question. What powers should the presidents have? It's an opinion question, but just think about that for a few minutes, write down a couple ideas, and then we will go from there. On to today's lesson. The focus of today's lesson is on the executive branch, which is the law enforcement branch of the government. Key word here is enforcement, because we're going to be looking at other branches as well, with the legislative being the law passing or the law making branch, and the judicial branch being the law interpreting branch of the government, so there will be differences on that. On to the background here. Our founding fathers wanted to divide power. This is something that will be discussed quite a bit. They divided power in many different ways. One way was with federalism, which means that they divided power between the federal and state governments, making it so that certain powers were reserved for each group. Beyond that, there are a lot of other ways that power is divided. In specific, we have the legislative branch, which is the law-making branch, the executive branch, the law-enforcing branch, and the judicial branch being the law-interpreting branch, which will be talked about in a later video. However, we're looking today at this idea of separation of powers, so let's underline that as we go here. Separation of powers, and how even at the federal government, there's not just one group that's in charge. So while a lot of people think about the president as being the only one who has any power or any authority, it's not really that way at all. Actually, all three of these branches are designed to be equal in power, even though in practice they might not seem that way. Our target for today is I can identify the key members and powers of the executive branch. We want to look at these two things for a reason. Key members and powers. Why? Because what we're looking at here with the key members are all the different people who have power in the government, and that's going to help us to see that it's not just one person who can control everything. And second, the powers, because we want to look at the powers and see what are the specific things they can and cannot do, and what do they rely on other people to allow them to do. So in other words, like when we look at laws, for instance, we'll see that there are powers that the executive branch has. However, in order for a law to be passed, it takes multiple branches really to all be involved for things to sync together well. Here's our target for today. There's Super Wilson with his dream of becoming president, and he said, "I should run for president in 2020 when I am old enough. I wonder what challenges I might face if I were to work in the Oval Office." So here he is in the Oval Office, envisioning tomahawks being thrown. Abs of steel, that doesn't hurt. Arrows, nah. Cannonballs, nice try. And Chuck Norris, don't even think about it. You never know what else will come though too. It might be birds, and could be aliens, and you know, maybe even this Native American's angry at me, I'll just give him a kick and a punch. And yes, I am floating. Don't act surprised, you knew I could fly. Alright, on to today's lesson. The executive branch. The main job is to enforce or to carry out laws. It involves many people on many levels. It ranges from the president to the local police, and in truth, it actually really can count in about, we're looking at millions of people. Why is that? When you look at the executive branch, there are so many people that are charged with enforcing the laws or executing the laws. Like for instance, a law that you could consider would be that we have laws related to education. And you have a lot of people that are charged with carrying out the laws of educating children. And if you want to think about how we can prove that this person is a part of a certain branch of the government, think about the fact that with the executive branch in specific, you have laws related to education, and how does everybody in a school system get paid? It's through tax money. That means they are part of the government to some extent. We're looking at a really low level, definitely not challenging the president for his authority, but something interesting to think about. Lots of people. The FBI, though, one example. The head of the executive branch is the president. The president is elected every 4 years, and they are elected by what is known as the Electoral College. The Electoral College. This is a complicated idea that I'm going to save for a little different setting here to explain the voting of the president. That'll be a separate video. However, the Electoral College, president needs to get the majority of the Electoral College votes. It's not based upon a popular vote or who gets the most votes in the country, which seems kind of odd, but that is the way that it's set up in our country. And that was actually put in place as a design to help out smaller states to make sure that their voice was heard. The requirements for the executive, excuse me, for the president that is that they must be 35 years old at least, they must be a natural-born U.S. citizen, and they must have lived in the United States for at least 14 years prior to the election. This gets a little bit tricky with this whole natural-born U.S. citizen, or naturalized citizen is another way that it can be referred to. There's some disputing this and what that actually means because it's a little bit vague. In other words, it's not super clear. We haven't really had a major dispute with this just yet in history, though you never know when one could come about. That's the Electoral College, and we'll come back to that. Let's go into the powers of the president and what they can and cannot do. First, one of the titles of the president is that they are the chief legislator of the country. They are given this title because they are able to suggest new laws and work for their passage. Really, when you think about a president and the power that they have, they are very, very well known. And I don't want to say they're trusted as in everybody trusts the president. However, when the president says that we need to pass something or we need to consider something, it holds a lot more clout and a whole lot more power than somebody who's in a lesser position in government. So when the president gets on TV and campaigns for something and gives a speech saying, hey, we need to do this or we need to do that, it means a lot more to the people of the country than anybody else in the government. So that's really one of the big things to consider there. The other power of the president that's really important, and we'll talk about Congress in a different video, is that Congress is the one who gets to select and choose the laws to make. In other words, they're the ones that vote on them first and actually do the writing of them for the most part. Once it gets to the president, however, he actually is able to shut down a law, or I shouldn't say shut it down, he's able to veto it, which means that he's not going to approve of it. He is checked on this, and we'll come back to the checks in a different video on checks and balances. But when a president vetoes a law, it makes it very difficult for it to be passed. So there's our veto power. So basically the president can overpower the say or the majority of these people here in the Congress, but not if they have a 2/3 majority, something we'll come back to later on. Next, the president is also called the commander-in-chief, which means that they are the highest-ranking officer in the armed forces. They can appoint and remove top military commanders, and they can use the armed forces to deal with crises, that's plural for crisis, at home and abroad, meaning they can actually send soldiers to battle either in America or overseas without the approval of anybody else. And this maybe doesn't seem like that big of a deal to you, but this is actually really, really, really important. Because when you look at the powers of Congress, one of the powers is that they have to declare war. That is a congressional power. It is not a presidential power. However, the president is actually able to send the military. So if you look at most of the recent conflicts in history, they do not involve declaring war via Congress. They actually involve the president just saying, hey, we're going to send people over and we're going to get started here. Important thing to understand. So the president's the head of really all the different military branches. And I want to say one more thing about this being the purpose of our founding fathers doing this was because they wanted the citizens to control the military, not the government. And you're thinking, wait a minute. What are you talking about? That's an idiotic statement because this is the government. It is, however, the head of it is an elected official. It is not somebody who's just within the government. So if the president is number one in terms of the military, the president has to answer to the people or else he will not be elected, and therefore that helps to keep the people in control of the military. Hopefully that makes sense. Next, we have our chief diplomat, another title of the president. That's because the president directs the nation's foreign policy. The president is able to select or appoint ambassadors. These are people who are representing America to go overseas. So in other words, he has to say, okay, we're going to send somebody overseas to go and talk to China. The president gets to select who that will be. Now that may not sound like a big power, but when you really think about it, these ambassadors can have a whole lot of authority, and they are really going to show what America is like. So it's very important who they select in this role. The president also gets to make treaties, or really I should say negotiate treaties with other countries. So the president can go overseas, talk with other foreign leaders, and they can agree to, let's say, stop a war or do something like that, and they can agree to the terms of those treaties. However, in order for them to actually take effect and be approved in America, the Senate must do that. The Senate must do that. Third, the president can sign executive agreements into effect. Excuse me. They're informal agreements, usually dealing with trade, and they don't have to get Senate approval for it, which actually sounds kind of crazy, but something interesting as well. So, getting to select our foreign ambassadors is important. Maybe we could have Buddy the Elf as an ambassador. I don't know. That doesn't seem to be overly effective to me, and I don't think the president would want to do that. And remember, they have to get everything or all of their appointed ambassadors approved by Congress too, so it's not going to be so easy to get that accomplished. Some other powers to consider. The president has the ability to appoint Supreme Court justices, though they must be approved by Congress. We'll talk about what a Supreme Court justice is in a different video. They can also call special sessions on Congress, in other words, forcing Congress to meet. That's an interesting topic. Maybe want to look into a little bit more as well. They can grant pardons to federal offenders, somebody who commits a federal crime. Even if they're found guilty and they are in prison, the president can actually step in and say, nope, they're fine, they're off the hook, we're not going to actually charge them with the crimes. Interesting to think about. They can also grant them clemency, which would be putting a lesser punishment on them, and they can take away some of their punishment if they think the punishment is too severe for the crime. That's put in place just in case the courts in the legislative branch have laws and punishments that seem a little bit too harsh for a specific situation. It lets the president come in and kind of fix it. And finally, the president is a symbol for the nation. Something just important to recognize about the president. This is from Jimmy Carter, who's a former president. He said, when things It should be. When things go bad, you get entirely too much blame. When things go good, you get entirely too much credit. It kind of reminds me of like a head football coach. Whoa, I'm going back in time with an old football coach there. But president kind of reminds you of that. And finally, the executive departments. So the president cannot carry out every law in the country. Remember, he's the chief executive. He's only one person, so he actually has a whole lot of people involved to help him out. There are many different departments to carry out the different laws, and now there are 15 separate executive departments, each responsible for their own area enforcement. And all these departments answer to the president. So we have the Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, which is like trade, Department of Defense, that's where the military is, Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Homeland Security, that's a more recent one, we'll talk about that in a second. Department of Housing and Urban Development, helping to design cities and things along those lines. Department of Justice, which is like all the courts and everything along those lines. Department of Labor, affecting jobs and rules related to jobs. Department of State, taking care of the country as a whole. Department of the Interior, similar in nature, but different in terms of the specific rules that it has. Department of the Treasury, dealing with money and things related to that. Department of Transportation, and Department of Veterans Affairs. That one is dealing with people who previously served in the armed forces. There's a lot there for them. The most recent one is the Department of Homeland Security, which was actually created after 9/11. So talk about how 9/11 created or changed our country a lot. That's an example. I know I just went through that absurdly fast, so don't be too worried because you're not going to have to memorize them all. But I wanted to show you each of the different things that the president theoretically oversees, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how they're able to do that. When you look at the budget for the executive department, it is absolutely crazy how much money they have. This is going back in time a few years, and I want to point out the years to you here just so you know this. 2009, 2010, I'll give it a figure 8 so it doesn't look so terrible. But you look at it, the Department of Defense had $513 billion at their disposal for that year. Transportation, Department of Transportation that is, had $70.5 billion they were able to spend. Going down to a total of $1 trillion was the amount of money that was spent by the executive department in that year. So if you think about how much tax money we're putting in and how much money is being spent, it is quite a bit. Now, since the president can't do it all on its own, the other thing that he has is the cabinet, which is a group of special advisors that are there to help the president so that he can make good decisions. These special advisors provide him with key information. In this cabinet is actually the heads of each of the 15 executive departments. That's not literal heads, that's figurative. In other words, the people who are the leaders of those cabinets, or of those departments. So, these people are appointed by the president, and these are really, really important selections, let's say, for the president, because the people who he picks to advise him on these issues, well, they're going to play a really important role. And given that people have their own different opinions, they're not always going to be on the same page with everything. But nonetheless, they're different for each president, so they do change. Now, President Obama, let's say somebody asks him about the urban development policies in Las Vegas. Well, he's not going to be able to answer that all on his own, so he's going to actually have to work with his cabinet here, and that's an important thing to understand. So, he's going to go to his cabinet, say, okay, there we go. There's my head of the Department of Urban Development. Finally, there are some independent executive agencies that are extremely important to understand. They do not answer directly to the president, per se. However, they play a really big role in our country. NASA, the Peace Corps, and the CIA are 3 examples. Like, for example, NASA, their spending was $17.8 billion going back to 2009. That's a lot of money. And they're independent of the executive department, yet they still kind of function similarly to it. Which brings us to the end of today's lesson. I know that was quick. Make sure you get the big ideas here. And if you need to watch it a couple times, you can go back and do that. So Super Wilson says, help me make my dream a reality, and go break a mental sweat. The rest of the lesson, 2 things. Number 1, we have a quiz on abundant schools, and number 2, you also have the second sheet in the note guide on looking at some of the specific rules that the president can do and some of the campaign promises that Super Wilson's looking to make. I hope that lesson made sense to you.